Sometimes the smallest name on a piece of paper can destroy the biggest lie ever told. The ballroom inside the Washington Convention Center shimmered beneath a sea of white lights and giant digital screens. Hundreds of students from across America sat shoulder to shoulder with their families, teachers, sponsors, and reporters. The air carried a nervous energy, the kind that only appeared when dreams were about to become reality. On the massive stage at the front of the room, banners displaying the National Science Fair logo hung beside American flags. Camera crews moved carefully between rows. Parents clutched phones. Teachers whispered encouragement. Every eye remained fixed on the stage where the final award of the evening was about to be announced. Near the front row sat a small boy in a navy blazer that looked slightly too large for his thin shoulders. Mason Brooks folded his hands together and stared at the floor. At 10 years old, he had already learned that excitement could be dangerous. Hope had a way of making disappointment hurt more. Beside him, his mother sat quietly. Nia Brooks wore a simple dark green dress and a silver necklace she rarely removed. Her posture was straight, her expression calm. Yet beneath that calm exterior, her heart pounded harder with every second that passed. She reached over and squeezed her son's hand. Mason glanced at her. She offered a gentle smile. The kind of smile that said everything would be okay no matter what happened next. It was the same smile she had given him before every spelling bee, every science competition, every difficult moment of his young life. Across the ballroom, another figure commanded attention without even trying. Ethan Whitmore sat at the head table reserved for sponsors and executives. At 41 years old, he had become one of the most recognizable names in American technology. Founder and CEO of Whitmore Dynamics, billionaire entrepreneur, magazine cover regular, keynote speaker, investor. The room seemed to bend around his presence. Yet tonight his attention wasn't on business deals or media appearances. He was simply fulfilling his role as lead sponsor for the nation's largest youth science competition. The announcer stepped forward. The microphone crackled softly before her voice filled the hall. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us for the National Science Fair Championship. Applause echoed through the room. Massive screens flashed images of young inventors and engineering projects. Tonight we celebrate innovation, determination, and the future of American science. Another wave of applause rolled across the ballroom. Ethan glanced at his watch. He had another flight waiting after the ceremony. Another meeting. Another city. Another endless obligation. Then the announcer smiled. And now, the winner of this year's National Science Fair Grand Prize. The room fell silent. Even the cameras seemed to pause. Mason lowered his eyes. Nia wrapped her fingers around his hand. The announcer opened a gold envelope. This year's champion developed an adaptive energy management system capable of reducing electricity waste in public school buildings. Murmurs spread across the audience. His project impressed every judge with its originality, technical sophistication, and practical application. Ethan looked up with mild curiosity. Please join me in congratulating. The pause felt endless. Mason Brooks. The ballroom exploded. Cheers erupted from every direction. Teachers jumped from their seats. Cameras flashed like tiny bursts of lightning. Mason froze. For a second, he looked genuinely confused, as if he thought someone else must share his name. Then Nia laughed through sudden tears and pulled him into a hug. The audience rose into a standing ovation. Mason slowly stood. His legs felt unsteady as he made his way toward the stage. Ethan watched politely. Another talented kid. Another bright future. Then the giant screens switched to the winner's profile. A photograph appeared. Mason's smiling face filled the room. Beneath it appeared his full name in bold white letters. Mason Brooks. Ethan's gaze drifted toward the screen, then stopped. Something tightened inside his chest. Brooks. His eyes narrowed slightly. The noise around him faded. Brooks. It wasn't an uncommon last name. Thousands of Americans carried it. Yet something about seeing it there stirred a memory he hadn't touched in years. A memory buried beneath boardrooms, acquisitions, headlines, and success. Across the stage, Mason accepted the trophy with both hands. The audience applauded louder. Ethan barely heard them. Brooks. The name echoed inside his mind. Then Mason stepped toward the microphone. The bright lights illuminated his face. Ethan looked up fully for the first time. The moment he did, the air seemed to leave his lungs. The boy's smile, the shape of his jaw, the way he tilted his head while adjusting the microphone. Ethan's hand slowly tightened around the armrest of his chair. For the first time that evening, he wasn't looking at a science champion. He was staring at a ghost from his past. And somewhere deep inside a place he thought had gone silent forever, a forgotten name whispered back to life. Nia Brooks. The applause continued long after Mason stepped away from the microphone, but Ethan barely heard any of it. Around him, executives stood and smiled. Sponsors shook hands. Reporters moved through the aisles searching for reactions. Yet he remained seated for several seconds, staring at the giant screen where Mason's photograph still lingered. The resemblance unsettled him in a way he could not explain. He had spent years training himself to focus only on facts, numbers, and outcomes. Emotion was inefficient. Regret was unproductive. Memory was a distraction. Yet the moment he saw that boy, 10 years of carefully organized distance began to crack. On stage, Mason carefully held the oversized trophy against his chest while photographers gathered him with the other finalists. His smile looked natural, unforced, the smile of a child who had earned every bit of recognition he received. Ethan noticed the confidence in the boy's posture. He noticed the curiosity in his eyes as he looked around the ballroom. Most of all, he noticed the way Mason seemed completely unaware that anyone could be staring at him for reasons beyond his accomplishment. The master of ceremonies continued speaking about innovation and education, but Ethan's attention drifted elsewhere. A memory surfaced without warning. A university laboratory, bright fluorescent lights, the smell of coffee and soldering equipment. A young woman laughing as she adjusted a prototype sensor on a cluttered workbench. Nia Brooks. The name hit him with surprising force. He had not spoken it aloud in years. He had convinced himself that chapter belonged to another lifetime. Before investors, before headlines, before Whitmore Dynamics became one of the largest technology companies in America. Back when success was still a dream instead of a responsibility. Ethan blinked and returned to the present. Across the ballroom, Nia stood beside the stage waiting for her son. She looked older than the woman in his memories, but there was no mistaking her. The same graceful posture, the same calm strength, the same eyes that once saw through every excuse he ever made. His chest tightened. For a moment, he wondered whether she had already seen him, whether she knew he was here, whether she had spent the evening deliberately avoiding his gaze. Mason finally stepped off the stage and hurried toward her. Nia opened her arms immediately. The boy wrapped one arm around the trophy and the other around his mother. Ethan watched the brief embrace. There was something painfully simple about it. Something honest. The kind of connection no amount of money could manufacture. Nearby, one of Ethan's senior executives approached his table. "Amazing event tonight," the man said. "That kid is going places." Ethan nodded absently. What was his project again? The executive smiled. Energy optimization software. Honestly, it was incredible. One of the judges said it could save school districts millions over time. Ethan looked back toward Mason. How old is he? 10. The answer landed harder than it should have. 10. The number echoed through his mind. 10 years. 10 years since Nia disappeared from his life. 10 years since the final phone call that never happened. 10 years since he convinced himself she had simply moved on. A photographer stepped in front of the stage and called for the winners to gather for a final picture. Mason joined the other students. Nia remained off to the side. Ethan found himself standing before he consciously decided to move. His executive looked surprised. "Everything okay?" "Yes," Ethan replied automatically. But it was not okay. Not even close. He slowly made his way toward the edge of the ballroom. Each step felt strangely heavy. Halfway there, he stopped. What exactly was he doing? Walking up to a woman he had not seen in a decade? Introducing himself to a child whose existence made no sense? He should leave. That would be the rational decision. Yet his feet refused to move toward the exit. Across the room, Mason turned during the group photograph and laughed at something another student said. The expression hit Ethan like a flash of recognition. It was not merely similarity anymore. It was familiarity, the kind that settled deep in a person's instincts before logic could intervene. For the first time all evening, uncertainty crept into Ethan Whitmore's carefully controlled world. Then a reporter approached Nia near the stage. Ethan watched as she answered a few questions politely. The reporter smiled and pointed toward Mason. Nia glanced at her son with unmistakable pride. A second later, the reporter asked another question. Ethan could not hear the words from where he stood. He only saw Nia's response. Her smile softened. Her eyes moved toward Mason again. Then she said something that made the reporter laugh. It looked like the answer of a mother who had spent years celebrating victories nobody else witnessed. Ethan remained frozen. Because beneath every question racing through his mind, one thought refused to disappear. If Mason Brooks was 10 years old, and if Nia Brooks was truly his mother, then the timeline aligned far too perfectly to ignore. The celebration slowly began to fade as families gathered their belongings and students carried trophies through the crowded ballroom. Conversations filled the air, warm and excited, but Ethan remained where he was. He watched Nia and Mason from a distance, careful not to draw attention to himself. Every instinct told him to walk away and investigate privately later. That was how he handled every problem in business. Gather facts first, act second. Yet this did not feel like business. This felt personal in a way he had not experienced for years. Mason stood beside a display table answering questions from judges and reporters. His hands moved enthusiastically as he explained his project. Ethan found himself listening. The boy spoke with confidence, but not arrogance. Every answer was thoughtful. Every explanation was clear. More than once, he saw adults exchange surprised glances after hearing him speak. Then Mason began describing the inspiration behind his energy management system. Ethan stepped slightly closer. Most schools waste electricity because the systems are not talking to each other, Mason explained. I wanted to build something that could help schools save money and use less energy without needing expensive upgrades. One of the judges smiled. That is a pretty ambitious idea for someone your age. Mason shrugged. My mom says big problems are usually solved one small step at a time. Nia smiled from nearby. Ethan felt something shift inside him. He remembered hearing almost those exact words years ago. Nia used to say them whenever he became frustrated during long nights in the university engineering lab. One small step at a time. He had not thought about that phrase in over a decade. The realization unsettled him even more. Another reporter approached Mason. What do you want to be when you grow up? She asked. Mason laughed softly. I do not know yet. Maybe an engineer. Maybe an inventor. Maybe both. The surrounding adults chuckled. Anybody inspire you? The reporter asked. Mason thought for a moment. Actually, yes. Ethan found himself paying even closer attention. There is a technology founder named Ethan Whitmore. I read about some of his early research projects online. One of them gave me ideas for part of my design. The reporter nodded approvingly. That is quite a role model. Ethan froze. Nia's expression changed almost imperceptibly. It lasted less than a second, but he noticed it. A flicker of surprise. A shadow passing behind her eyes. Then it disappeared. Mason continued speaking, completely unaware. His research was really smart, he said. I figured if someone could build things that help millions of people, maybe I could build something that helps my community too. Ethan stared at the boy. The words landed harder than he expected. He had spent years hearing praise from investors, journalists, and industry leaders. None of it affected him the way this did. Because this admiration came from a child who looked increasingly familiar with every passing minute. Eventually, the interview ended. Families began heading toward the exits. Nia placed a hand on Mason's shoulder and pointed toward the lobby. The boy nodded. As they started walking, Ethan made a decision before he could talk himself out of it. He stepped forward. The distance between them closed rapidly. For a brief moment, he considered calling Nia's name, but the sound caught in his throat. 10 years was a long time. Too long. Then fate intervened. Mason accidentally dropped a folder containing project notes and diagrams. Papers scattered across the carpet. Several pages slid toward Ethan's polished shoes. Without thinking, he bent down and picked one up. Mason hurried over. Sorry, sir. Ethan handed him the page. No problem. Their eyes met for the first time. Up close, the resemblance struck even harder. Mason smiled politely. Thank you. Ethan's chest tightened. The voice was different. The personality was different. Yet something felt impossibly familiar. Before he could respond, Nia arrived beside her son. She reached for the remaining papers. Then she looked up. Time seemed to stop. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. The noise of the ballroom faded into the background. Mason glanced between the two adults. Confusion appeared on his face. Nia's expression remained composed, but Ethan could see the tension behind her calm eyes. She recognized him immediately. Of course she did. "Hello, Nia," Ethan said quietly. Her fingers tightened slightly around the folder. Mason looked at his mother. "You know him?" Ethan waited. 10 years of unanswered questions suddenly stood between them. Nia inhaled slowly and met his gaze without hesitation. "Yes," she said. "I know him." Mason looked from his mother to Ethan and back again. The excitement of the evening had been replaced by curiosity. Around them, the ballroom continued to empty as families headed toward elevators and parking garages, but the three of them remained frozen in a small pocket of silence. Nia was the first to recover. "We should get going," she said gently. Her voice was calm, but Ethan recognized the careful control behind it. Mason adjusted his grip on the trophy. "Mom, who is he?" Nia hesitated. "Only for a second. Someone I knew a long time ago." Ethan felt the answer settle heavily between them. Someone. Not friend. Not colleague. Not former partner. Just someone. Mason nodded politely. "Nice to meet you, sir." Ethan forced a small smile. "Nice to meet you too, Mason." Hearing himself say the boy's name felt strangely significant. Mason offered his hand. Ethan shook it automatically. The gesture lasted only a moment, but the instant their hands touched, another memory surfaced. 10 years earlier, a university campus in Boston. Snow falling outside the engineering building. Nia laughing because he had forgotten gloves again. They had been students then, spending more time in laboratories than classrooms. Neither of them had money. Neither of them had influence. They only had ambition and each other. Ethan blinked, forcing the memory away. The present felt complicated enough. Nia shifted the folder against her side. "Congratulations on your company's sponsorship," she said politely. The words sounded formal, distant, as though she were speaking to a stranger instead of someone who once knew her favorite coffee order, her dreams, and every fear she rarely shared with anyone else. "Thank you," Ethan replied. "And congratulations to Mason. His project was remarkable." Pride softened Nia's expression for the first time. "He worked hard." Mason smiled. "For 8 months." Ethan looked at him. 8 months. "Every weekend," Mason said proudly. "And after school." "That is impressive. Mom helped a lot." Nia immediately shook her head. Not enough to take credit. Ethan noticed the familiar humility. She had always been that way. Even in college, she rarely talked about her own achievements despite consistently outperforming nearly everyone around her. Before the conversation could continue, another student called Mason's name from across the lobby. Mason turned excitedly. Several finalists were gathering near the exit for photographs. "Can I go say goodbye?" he asked. Nia nodded. "Stay where I can see you." Mason hurried away, clutching the trophy against his chest. Ethan watched him disappear into the crowd. Once the boy was out of earshot, the atmosphere changed immediately. The warmth vanished. Silence returned. Nia looked toward the floor for a moment before meeting Ethan's eyes again. "What are you doing here?" she asked quietly. The question surprised him. "The company sponsors the event." "That is not what I meant." Ethan exhaled slowly. "I saw your name. And then I saw him." Nia did not respond. "Nia," he continued, lowering his voice, "how old is Mason?" Her expression became unreadable. "You already heard the answer." 10. "Yes." Ethan glanced toward the group of children laughing near the exit. 10 years old. The words felt heavier the second time. Nia crossed her arms lightly. Not defensive. Protective. "What exactly are you asking?" He knew the answer mattered. He also knew he was afraid to hear it. For years he had accepted the story he told himself. Nia had left. Their relationship ended. Life moved on. Simple. Clean. Finished. But nothing felt simple anymore. "Did you ever try to contact me?" he asked. A flicker passed through her eyes. Pain. Disappointment. Maybe both. "For a long time," she said. Ethan stared at her. "What does that mean?" Nia looked away briefly, toward the glass windows overlooking the city lights. "It means there are conversations that should have happened years ago." Before Ethan could respond, Mason came running back toward them, smiling and breathless. "Mom, they are taking one last group picture outside." Nia immediately softened. "Then you should go." Mason nodded enthusiastically. "Come with me. I will be right behind you." The boy hurried off again. Ethan watched him disappear through the lobby doors. Neither adult spoke until he was gone. Then Nia looked directly at him. "You should know something," she said quietly. "The story you have been telling yourself for the last 10 years is not the truth. The words settled between them with a weight that neither of them could ignore. Ethan stared at Nia, searching her face for answers that seemed to multiply instead of disappear. For years he had believed he understood exactly how their story ended. She left. She stopped returning calls. She disappeared from Boston without explanation. Eventually, he buried the hurt beneath work, ambition, and the relentless pace of building a company. Now, standing in a crowded convention center thousands of miles from the life they once shared, he was being told that everything he believed might be wrong. "What does that mean?" he asked quietly. Nia looked toward the glass doors where Mason and the other finalists were gathering for photographs beneath the city lights. Her expression softened as she watched her son laugh, with children his own age. "It means there were things happening around us that neither of us understood at the time," she said. Ethan felt frustration rising. "Nia, I spent years wondering what happened." "So did I." The answer came without anger. That somehow made it worse. Before he could respond, a group of parents passed between them, temporarily breaking the conversation. By the time the crowd cleared, Nia had regained the calm distance she seemed to wear like armor. "This is not the place," she said. "Then tell me where." She studied him for a long moment. The Ethan standing before her was different from the young man she once knew. The expensive suit, the confidence, the public image, all of it reflected years of success. Yet beneath it she could still see traces of the ambitious engineering student who once spent entire nights chasing impossible ideas because he believed technology could change lives. "Why now?" she asked. "Because I saw you." Ethan glanced toward Mason. "Because I saw him." Nia followed his gaze. For a brief second, something unreadable crossed her face. Not fear, not guilt, something closer to resignation, as though she had always known this day would eventually arrive. Outside, the group photograph ended. Mason immediately hurried back toward the building, carrying his trophy with both hands. His excitement filled the space before he even reached them. "Mom, they said the picture might be on the competition website tomorrow." Nia smiled. "That is wonderful." Mason looked at Ethan. "Have you ever been to one of these before?" Ethan nodded. "A few." "Were they this big?" "Not even close." Mason laughed. "I was nervous the whole day." "You did not look nervous." "That is because Mom made me practice." Nia rolled her eyes slightly. "I told him to breathe." "A lot," Mason added. The three of them shared a brief moment of unexpected ease. It lasted only seconds, but Ethan noticed something important. Being around Mason felt natural, comfortable, as though a connection existed before either of them understood why. Mason adjusted the trophy and looked up at Ethan again. "Did you really build your company from scratch?" Ethan smiled faintly. "Not completely. A lot of people helped." "Still, that is amazing. Your project was amazing." Mason's face brightened immediately. "You really think so?" "I do." The sincerity in Ethan's voice surprised even him. Mason grinned. "That means a lot." Nia watched the exchange carefully. She noticed how easily the conversation flowed. She noticed the similarities she had spent years trying not to think about. The same curiosity, the same focus when discussing ideas, the same tendency to ask questions instead of talking about themselves. Her chest tightened unexpectedly. "We should get to the airport," she said softly. Mason's smile faded slightly. "Already? Our flight leaves in 2 hours." Ethan looked at her. "You are leaving tonight?" "We have school on Monday." The reminder struck him harder than expected. Of course they had a life, a routine, responsibilities. He was the outsider here. The interruption. Mason shifted the trophy under one arm. "Maybe I will see you again someday." Ethan looked at the boy. Something deep inside him resisted letting the moment end so easily. "Maybe sooner than you think," he said before he could stop himself. Nia's eyes met his immediately. A silent warning, a silent question. Ethan understood both. Yet as he watched Mason standing beside his mother beneath the bright convention center lights, one truth became impossible to ignore. Whatever happened 10 years ago, whatever secrets remained hidden, whatever explanations still waited to be uncovered, he was no longer willing to walk away without knowing them. The flight back to Atlanta left just before midnight. By the time the plane reached cruising altitude, Mason had fallen asleep against the window with the trophy resting carefully on his lap. The cabin lights were dim. Most passengers slept or stared quietly at glowing screens. Nia sat beside her son and looked out at the darkness beyond the glass. The city lights had long disappeared beneath the clouds, but her thoughts remained trapped inside the convention center. She had always known this day might come. Not the science fair, not the award, the reunion. For 10 years, she had built a life around moving forward. She focused on raising Mason, paying bills, helping with school projects, and creating stability. She never wasted energy imagining what would happen if Ethan returned. Yet now that it had happened, she felt something she had not expected. Exhaustion. Across the country, Ethan sat alone inside the back seat of a black sedan heading toward his hotel. Washington streets passed outside the tinted windows in streaks of white and gold. His phone buzzed repeatedly with messages from executives and investors. He ignored every one of them. The driver glanced into the mirror. "Hotel, sir." Ethan hesitated. "No." The driver looked confused. "Sir." Ethan stared out the window. "Take me to the office." 40 minutes later, he stepped into the private headquarters of Whitmore Dynamics. The building was nearly empty at that hour. Security nodded as he entered. Most floors were dark. Only a few employees remained. Ethan walked directly to his office overlooking the city skyline. He loosened his tie and sat behind the desk. The silence felt overwhelming. For years, he had trained himself to solve problems through information. Data first, emotion later. He reached for his laptop. Within minutes, he had opened public records connected to the science competition. Mason's project summary appeared first, then photographs, then interview transcripts. Ethan studied every detail. The more he read, the harder it became to dismiss the possibility growing inside his mind. Eventually, he found a short biography prepared for finalists. Mason Brooks, age 10, Atlanta, Georgia, student inventor, academic honors, community volunteer projects. Ethan read every line twice. Then a detail caught his attention. Parent listed, Nia Brooks. No father listed. He leaned back slowly. His office suddenly felt smaller. 10 years. 10 years without a father listed anywhere. His gaze drifted toward the city lights beyond the glass. Questions multiplied faster than answers. If Mason was his son, why had Nia never told him? If she had tried, as she claimed, what happened to those attempts? Why had she disappeared so suddenly all those years ago? And why did her words still echo in his mind? The story you have been telling yourself for the last 10 years is not the truth. Ethan opened a drawer and removed an old storage box he had not touched in years. Most people would have thrown it away. He never had. Inside were photographs from college, competition badges, research notes, fragments of a life that existed before fame and responsibility consumed everything. Near the bottom sat a faded picture. Ethan picked it up carefully. The image showed 2 engineering students standing outside a laboratory after winning a university innovation award. Nia was laughing. He was holding a certificate. Neither of them looked toward the camera. They were looking at each other. Ethan stared at the photograph for a long time. Then he noticed something else. The date printed on the back. 11 years ago. Around the same time Mason would have been conceived. Ethan closed his eyes briefly. The timing aligned again. Another piece falling into place. Meanwhile, hundreds of miles away, Nia stood in the doorway of Mason's bedroom after arriving home. The trophy sat proudly on a shelf. Mason slept peacefully beneath a blue blanket, completely unaware of the storm beginning to gather around his life. Nia watched him for several moments. Then she quietly entered her own room. Inside her closet, hidden behind storage boxes, sat an old container she rarely opened. Tonight, she reached for it. Inside were letters, dozens of them, some folded, some unopened, some worn by time. On top rested a photograph of Ethan from years ago. Nia stared at it silently. Then she picked up the first letter and ran her fingers across the envelope. The handwriting belonged to her younger self. A letter she had written but never managed to deliver. And for the first time in years, she wondered whether Ethan had truly never received any of them. The next morning arrived far too quickly for either of them. In Atlanta, sunlight filtered through the kitchen windows as Mason sat at the table eating cereal while reading comments posted beneath the science fair results online. His excitement had not faded overnight. Every few minutes, he discovered another congratulatory message from teachers, classmates, or relatives. Nia stood at the counter pouring coffee, but her thoughts remained fixed on the box of letters hidden upstairs. She had barely slept. Memories she spent years burying had resurfaced with uncomfortable clarity. "Mom," Mason said suddenly, "do you think Mr. Whitmore was serious?" Nia looked up. About what? About seeing me again. She stirred her coffee slowly. Why does that matter? Mason shrugged. I do not know. He seemed nice. Nia forced a small smile. You met him for 5 minutes. Still. Mason grinned. It was pretty cool. Nia said nothing. Across the country, Ethan had not slept at all. The photograph from college still rested on his desk. Beside it sat printouts from the science competition and pages of public records he had reviewed throughout the night. By sunrise, he reached one unavoidable conclusion. Guessing was no longer enough. He needed facts. He picked up his phone and called the only person he trusted with sensitive matters. Daniel. His longtime attorney answered immediately. You are awake early. I need help looking into something. Business. Ethan stared at the city skyline. Personal. The silence on the other end lasted several seconds. Daniel knew Ethan rarely used that word. How personal? 10 years ago personal. Later that afternoon, Ethan found himself standing inside a storage archive owned by Whitmore Dynamics. Thousands of old corporate records were preserved there, including documents from the company's earliest years. He had not visited the archive in years. An employee guided him through rows of cabinets. Anything specific? She asked. Correspondence, Ethan replied. Around 10 years ago. An hour passed. Then another. Most files revealed nothing useful. Investor letters. University partnership proposals. Research agreements. Routine paperwork. Yet Ethan continued searching. Something about Nia's words refused to leave him alone. Eventually, he reached a section containing mail forwarded during the period when the company was moving between offices. Several boxes remained unopened since being archived years earlier. Ethan carefully lifted the lid from one container. Dust rose into the air. Inside sat hundreds of envelopes bundled together by date. He began sorting through them. 5 minutes later, his hand stopped moving. His pulse accelerated. Near the bottom of a stack sat an envelope addressed in handwriting he recognized instantly. Nia Brooks. Ethan stared at it. For a moment he could not breathe. Then he found another. And another. And another. The dates stretched across several months. Every one addressed to him. Every one unopened. His hands trembled slightly as he lifted the first envelope. 10 years. 10 years believing she never reached out. 10 years believing she chose silence. Yet here, hidden inside forgotten archive boxes, sat proof that she had written repeatedly. He carefully opened the oldest letter. The paper inside had yellowed slightly with age. The first line hit him immediately. Ethan, I have been trying to reach you for weeks. He closed his eyes. The room seemed to tilt beneath him. Back in Atlanta, Nia sat in her office finishing engineering reports for a local energy consulting firm. Her phone vibrated unexpectedly. She glanced at the screen. Unknown number. Normally she ignored those calls. Today something made her answer. Hello. For several seconds no one spoke. Then she heard a familiar voice. Quiet. Unsteady. I found them. Nia froze. Every sound around her disappeared. Found what? She asked, though part of her already knew the answer. Ethan exhaled slowly. The letters. Her eyes closed. 10 years of hurt, confusion, and unanswered questions seemed to rush into the silence between them. Neither spoke for several moments. Finally, Ethan's voice returned, softer than she had ever heard it. You did try to tell me. Nia looked out the office window toward the afternoon sky. I never stopped trying. Neither of them spoke for several seconds after the call connected. The silence felt different now. 10 years earlier, silence had been a wall. Now it felt like the first crack in one. Nia sat motionless at her desk, staring through the office window as late afternoon sunlight stretched across the Atlanta skyline. Ethan remained inside his office hundreds of miles away, surrounded by open boxes and forgotten letters. The distance between them suddenly seemed much smaller than it had the week before. How many were there? Nia finally asked. Ethan looked down at the stacks spread across his desk. More than 20. She closed her eyes briefly. 20 letters. 20 attempts. 20 pieces of her life that never reached the person they were written for. He opened another letter and looked at the faded handwriting. I never saw any of them. I know. Why did you stop? The question lingered between them. Nia leaned back in her chair. Because eventually you have to accept what the evidence tells you. Ethan frowned. Meaning? Meaning I thought you were choosing not to answer. The words hurt because they sounded exactly like what he had believed about her. For years they had carried the same wound from opposite directions. Ethan lowered himself into his chair. I thought you disappeared. Nia laughed softly, but there was sadness in it. I thought you abandoned me. The truth settled heavily over both of them. Neither had left willingly. Neither had known what happened. Somewhere in the middle, something or someone had broken the connection completely. Ethan looked toward the city lights beginning to appear outside his window. Nia. Yes. Does Mason know anything about me? She was quiet for several seconds. He knows your name. Ethan's heart skipped. What? Not the whole story. Then what does he know? Nia glanced toward a framed photograph sitting on her desk. It showed Mason holding a homemade science trophy from years ago. He knows there was someone who inspired me when I was young. Someone who believed impossible things could become real. Ethan did not know what to say. When he started becoming interested in engineering, he found your work on his own. A faint smile touched her lips. I did not tell him where to look. Ethan stared at the letters again. And he never asked questions? Of course he did. What did you tell him? Nia exhaled slowly. The truth I could honestly give him. Which was that his father was someone intelligent, someone ambitious, someone who once cared about changing the world. Ethan looked away. The description felt far kinder than he deserved. The conversation paused when a soft knock sounded at Nia's office door. A coworker stepped inside and handed her a folder requiring a signature. After a brief exchange, the door closed again. When she returned to the call, Ethan was speaking. I need to come to Atlanta. Nia froze. Ethan, I am serious. This is not something you rush. 10 years is not rushing. His voice remained calm, but she could hear the emotion underneath. I have spent one day knowing the truth, and it already feels like I lost a decade. Nia understood that feeling better than he realized. She had lived with it every day. There are still things we do not know, she said carefully. There are things I know. Ethan looked toward the photograph from college sitting on his desk. I know those letters were real. I know you tried to reach me. And I know every timeline points to the same possibility. Neither of them spoke the possibility aloud. Not yet. It remained too large, too important, too life-changing. Then another voice suddenly entered the conversation. Mom. Nia turned. Mason stood in the doorway holding a backpack over one shoulder. School had ended early because of travel from the competition. I did not know you were still working. Nia smiled immediately. Just finishing a call. Mason stepped closer. Is everything okay? Ethan listened quietly. Even through a phone speaker, hearing the boy's voice affected him in a way he could not explain. Nia nodded. Everything is fine. Mason noticed the expression on her face. You sure? She reached over and squeezed his shoulder. I am sure. For a moment Ethan could hear them talking softly. Ordinary conversation. Questions about homework. Plans for dinner. The simple rhythm of a life built together. Then Mason spoke again. Tell whoever is on the phone congratulations. Nia blinked. Congratulations? For helping sponsor the science fair. She smiled despite herself. I will. Ethan felt an unexpected warmth spread through his chest. A second later, Mason disappeared down the hallway. Nia returned her attention to the call. Neither of them mentioned what had just happened. They did not need to. Because for the first time since reconnecting, Ethan had not just heard about Mason. He had heard him as part of a normal day. And somehow that made everything feel even more real. 3 days passed before Ethan boarded a flight to Atlanta. During those 72 hours, he read every letter he had discovered. Some were short. Some stretched across multiple pages. Together they told the story of a woman trying desperately to reach someone she loved while believing she was being ignored. The first letters carried hope. The later ones carried confusion. The final ones carried heartbreak. None contained bitterness. None contained accusations. That realization haunted him most. Nia had every reason to be angry, yet even in her pain, she had never spoken about him with cruelty. When his plane touched down in Atlanta, the late afternoon sun painted the sky in shades of gold and orange. Ethan rented a car and drove through neighborhoods far removed from the corporate towers and luxury hotels that normally filled his schedule. The address Nia finally agreed to share led him to a quiet suburban community lined with oak trees and modest brick homes. Children rode bicycles along sidewalks. Neighbors waved from porches. Everything felt ordinary, real, human. Ethan parked across the street and sat behind the wheel for several moments. Through the windshield, he could see a basketball hoop near the driveway. A science project poster rested against a garage wall. Wind chimes moved gently beneath the porch roof. It was not the life he once imagined for himself. Yet looking at it now, he realized it might have been exactly the kind of life he had wanted before ambition consumed every corner of his future. His phone buzzed. A text message from Nia. "We are at the Community STEM Center." Ethan started the engine again. 20 minutes later, he arrived at a small educational facility attached to a public library. Through large windows, he could see children gathered around tables covered with robotics kits, circuit boards, and laptops. Then he spotted Mason. The boy stood in front of a group of younger students explaining something with animated enthusiasm. Several children listened as though he were the most important person in the room. Ethan remained near the entrance and watched quietly. Mason was not showing off. He was helping. Every time a student struggled, he knelt beside them and patiently explained the problem. Every time someone succeeded, he celebrated their progress. Pride swelled inside Ethan before he could stop it. Not pride in himself. Pride in the boy. Nia appeared beside him. "He volunteers every Saturday," she said. Ethan turned. "You did not tell me that." "There are a lot of things I did not tell you." Her tone was gentle rather than sharp. Ethan nodded. "Fair point." They stood side by side for a moment. Through the glass, Mason laughed at something one of the younger children said. The sound carried faintly into the hallway. "He is a good kid," Ethan said quietly. Nia smiled. "He really is." Ethan hesitated. Then he asked the question that had lived inside his mind for days. "Does he know why I am here?" Nia looked toward her son. "He knows we used to know each other." "And the rest?" "Not yet." Ethan understood. Whatever happened next could not be rushed. A few minutes later, the workshop ended. Students gathered their belongings and headed home. Mason looked up and immediately noticed Ethan standing near the entrance. Surprise crossed his face. Then excitement. "You came." Ethan smiled despite himself. "I said maybe sooner than you think." Mason hurried over. "This is awesome." Nia shook her head, amused. "Mason." "What?" he asked innocently. "You are acting like a celebrity walked in." "A celebrity did walk in." Ethan laughed softly. The sound surprised all three of them. It felt natural, easy. For the next hour, they talked about science, engineering, and future projects. Mason showed Ethan sketches for ideas he wanted to build. Ethan listened carefully, offering suggestions when asked. The conversation flowed effortlessly. More than once, Nia caught herself simply watching. The similarities were impossible to ignore now. The same excitement when discussing innovation. The same habit of getting lost inside ideas. The same spark in their eyes whenever a difficult problem appeared solvable. As the sun began to set, the library lights flickered on. Families departed. The parking lot slowly emptied. Then Mason asked a question that brought everything to a stop. "Can I ask something?" Ethan nodded. "Of course." Mason looked between him and his mother. "How exactly do you two know each other?" The evening air suddenly felt very still. The question lingered in the cooling evening air. Cars pulled out of the parking lot one by one. The last rays of sunlight disappeared behind the trees. Yet none of the three moved. Mason stood between them holding his backpack strap, completely unaware that he had just touched the center of a story that began long before he was born. Nia and Ethan exchanged a brief glance. Years of misunderstanding, distance, and unanswered questions seemed to pass silently between them. Mason noticed the hesitation immediately. "Was it a bad question?" he asked. "No," Nia replied gently. "Not a bad question." Ethan nodded. "Actually, it is a fair question." Mason shifted his weight. "Then why do both of you look nervous?" The honesty made Nia smile despite herself. Her son had always been observant. He noticed details other people missed. Ethan recognized the trait instantly because he possessed the same one. Nia took a slow breath. "Your mother and I went to college together," Ethan said carefully. Mason's eyes widened. "Seriously? Seriously? You never told me that." "There are a lot of things your mother probably never thought would become important." Mason looked at Nia. "You knew him before he was famous?" "Long before," she answered. "That is actually kind of amazing." Ethan laughed softly. "Back then there was nothing amazing about me." "I doubt that," Mason said. "You started a company that changed an entire industry." Ethan looked at the boy for a moment. "Back then I was mostly a student who drank too much coffee and spent too much time breaking prototypes." Mason grinned. "That sounds more believable." The tension eased slightly. Not gone, but lighter. They began walking toward the parking lot together. The evening breeze carried the scent of fresh-cut grass from a nearby field. Mason listened eagerly as Ethan shared stories from college engineering competitions. Most involved mistakes rather than victories. Failed experiments. Software crashes. Presentations that went wrong. Mason laughed repeatedly. "Wait," he said. "You accidentally erased your entire project the night before judging?" Ethan nodded. "Every file." "What did you do?" "Start it over." Mason stared in disbelief. "In one night." "I had help." Ethan glanced toward Nia. "A lot of help." Mason followed his gaze. "Mom." Nia rolled her eyes. "He is leaving out important details." "Such as?" Mason asked. "Such as the fact that he refused to sleep." Ethan smiled. "That part is true. And he drank so much coffee that he could barely stand still." "Also true." Mason laughed again. For several minutes the conversation felt easy. Natural. Then they reached the parking lot. Nia unlocked her car. The moment felt like it was ending too quickly. Ethan knew it. Nia knew it. Even Mason seemed aware of it. "Are you flying home tonight?" Mason asked. "Tomorrow morning," Ethan answered. "Oh." The disappointment in the boy's voice was subtle but noticeable. Ethan hesitated before speaking again. "Actually, there is something I wanted to ask." Nia looked at him carefully. "What?" "The National Youth Innovation Summit is next month in Chicago." Mason immediately recognized the event. "That is the biggest student technology conference in the country." Ethan nodded. "Whitmore Dynamics sponsors part of it." Mason's eyes widened. "No way." Ethan smiled. "Way." Nia folded her arms lightly. "Where is this going?" "The organizers invite a small group of exceptional students every year." Ethan looked at Mason. "I think your project deserves to be there." Mason stared at him. "You mean attend?" "I mean present." For several seconds the boy simply stood there. "You are serious?" "Completely." Excitement flashed across Mason's face, but it quickly faded into uncertainty. He looked at his mother. Ethan noticed the reaction immediately. Before any decision about science or travel, Mason always looked to Nia first. Not because he lacked confidence, because he trusted her. Nia saw the hopeful expression in her son's eyes and felt her heart tighten. Opportunities like this did not come often. Yet nothing about the situation was simple anymore. Ethan seemed to understand her concern. "There is no pressure," he said quietly. "Think about it." Mason looked between them. "Can we?" Nia smiled gently. "We can talk about it." The answer was enough. Mason grinned. As he climbed into the car, Ethan found himself watching the moment carefully. The backpack tossed into the back seat. The trophy still resting on the floorboard. The easy smile on the boy's face. Small details. Ordinary details. Yet each one felt precious. Nia closed the driver's door and lowered the window. For a moment neither she nor Ethan spoke. Then she looked at him and said something he never expected to hear. "Thank you." Ethan blinked. "For what?" Her gaze shifted briefly toward Mason sitting inside the car. "For seeing him." The words followed Ethan all the way back to his hotel. "Thank you for seeing him." They sounded simple on the surface, yet they carried a decade of meaning underneath. Long after midnight, he stood beside the window of his room overlooking downtown Atlanta and replayed the evening in his mind. Mason's excitement. Nia's cautious trust. The growing realization that every day of the last 10 years could have been different if those letters had reached him. For the first time in a very long time, business reports remained untouched on his desk. His attention belonged somewhere else entirely. The next morning, Ethan postponed his flight home. His assistant was shocked. Board meetings were rescheduled. Interviews were moved. Investors were informed that the CEO would be unavailable for another day. None of it mattered. Around noon, his phone buzzed with a message from Nia. "Mason wants to show you something." 20 minutes later, Ethan arrived at a public park near a small lake. Children played basketball on nearby courts. Families walked dogs along shaded paths. The air carried the warmth of an early Georgia afternoon. Near one of the picnic pavilions, Mason sat beside a laptop surrounded by notebooks and sketches. His face brightened immediately when he saw Ethan approaching. "You came." Ethan smiled. "You sound surprised." "I kind of am." Mason laughed. "Most adults say they are busy." The comment landed harder than the boy intended. Ethan pulled out a chair beside him. "What are we working on?" Within seconds, Mason launched into an explanation of a new project involving water conservation systems for public parks. Charts, diagrams, calculations, and research papers covered the table. Ethan listened carefully. Several times he forgot he was speaking with a 10-year-old. Mason's curiosity seemed endless. Every answer generated 3 new questions. Every obstacle became an opportunity to learn something else. An hour passed without either of them noticing. Nearby, Nia sat beneath a tree reading reports from work. Occasionally, she glanced toward them. Each time she did, she found them completely absorbed in conversation. Watching them together felt strangely emotional. She saw pieces of the young Ethan she once knew. The student who could spend hours discussing impossible ideas simply because he loved solving problems. Mason inherited that same hunger for discovery. The similarities were becoming impossible to ignore. Eventually, Mason opened a notebook filled with older projects. "This one was my first real invention," he said proudly. Ethan studied a rough sketch of an automated garden irrigation system. "How old were you?" 7. Ethan laughed softly. "At 7, I was mostly trying not to fail math." Mason looked genuinely confused. Really? Really? That makes me feel better." Their conversation drifted naturally from science to school, then from school to life. For the first time, Mason began asking personal questions. "Did you always know you wanted to start a company?" Ethan shook his head. "Not even close." "Then what changed?" Ethan considered the answer carefully. "I met people who believed I could do more than I believed myself." Mason nodded thoughtfully. "Mom says that happens sometimes." Ethan glanced toward Nia. She was still reading beneath the tree, unaware of their conversation. "Your mother is usually right." Mason smiled. Then his expression grew more serious. "Can I ask you something else?" "Of course." The boy looked down briefly before speaking. "Why did you seem so surprised when you saw me at the science fair?" Ethan felt his heartbeat slow. The question had finally arrived. Not because Mason suspected the truth. Because children notice things adults hope they miss. Ethan chose his words carefully. "Because seeing you reminded me of someone I used to care about very much." Mason followed his gaze toward Nia. Understanding appeared immediately. "My mom." Ethan nodded. "Your mom." Mason was quiet for a moment. "She cared about you too, did she not?" The innocence of the question carried no judgment, only curiosity. Ethan looked out across the lake where sunlight shimmered on the water's surface. "Yes," he said softly. "I think she did." Neither noticed Nia lowering her report from beneath the tree. She had heard enough of the conversation to understand where it was going. For the first time since Ethan returned to their lives, she realized something important. The greatest challenge ahead would not be uncovering the truth. The truth was already finding its way to the surface. The real challenge would be helping a 10-year-old boy understand how deeply that truth could change all 3 of their lives. The following week unfolded with a strange mixture of normal life and extraordinary change. Ethan returned to New York, but the distance no longer felt the same. Every morning began with messages about Mason's latest ideas. Every evening ended with discussions about engineering problems that somehow turned into conversations about life. What surprised Ethan most was how naturally it happened. There was no grand plan, no carefully designed process, just a growing connection built one conversation at a time. Meanwhile, Mason seemed happier than Nia had seen in months. The upcoming Innovation Summit in Chicago had become his primary focus. His notebooks multiplied across the kitchen table. Diagrams covered entire pages. Research articles remained stacked beside his bed. More than once, Nia walked into the living room after midnight only to discover her son still sketching new concepts beneath a reading lamp. One Saturday afternoon, Ethan joined a video call to review Mason's presentation. What began as a 30-minute meeting stretched into nearly 2 hours. They debated software efficiency, renewable energy systems, and future applications for school districts. Nia listened from the kitchen while preparing dinner. At one point, she stopped chopping vegetables and simply watched. The similarity between them had become impossible to ignore, not only in appearance, in the way they thought, the way they approached problems, the way excitement transformed their voices whenever a difficult challenge appeared solvable. After the call ended, Mason leaned back in his chair and smiled. "He understands exactly what I mean every time." Nia looked up from the counter. "That must be nice." "It is." He hesitated. "Do you think people can be alike even if they do not spend time together?" The question caught her off guard. "Why do you ask?" Mason shrugged. "Just wondering." But she knew he was thinking about Ethan. The same possibility had quietly begun forming in her own mind weeks earlier. 2 days before the summit, Another development changed everything. Daniel, Ethan's attorney and longtime friend, called with information he had been investigating. Ethan listened carefully from his office. The findings were not complicated. They were devastating. Records revealed that during the chaotic months when Whitmore Dynamics was relocating offices, dozens of personal letters had been misrouted and archived incorrectly. Most importantly, several internal forwarding requests connected to Ethan had been altered by an executive assistant who worked directly under instructions from someone higher within the company. Ethan felt his stomach tighten. "Who?" he asked quietly. Daniel hesitated. "Your mother." Silence filled the office. Ethan slowly lowered himself into his chair. For several seconds he could not speak. "Are you certain?" "Completely." Daniel's voice remained gentle. "The documentation is clear." Ethan stared out the window. The skyline blurred slightly. His mother had always opposed his relationship with Nia. She believed his future required different priorities, different connections, different expectations. Yet he never imagined she would interfere this deeply. "There is more," Daniel said. Ethan closed his eyes briefly. "Go ahead. Evidence suggests she knew Nia was trying to contact you." The words landed with crushing weight. 10 years. 10 years of absence. 10 years of missed birthdays, first days of school, science projects, and ordinary moments that could never be recovered. Not because Nia failed to reach him. Not because he abandoned them. Because someone decided they should never receive the chance to choose for themselves. Later that evening, Ethan called Nia. She answered immediately. He told her everything. When he finished, neither spoke for several moments. Finally, Nia exhaled slowly. "I suspected something like that." Ethan looked down at his desk. "You suspected?" "Not at first. But eventually the silence stopped making sense." Her voice remained calm. No anger. No triumph. Just sadness. "I kept wondering how two people could try so hard to find each other and fail every time." Ethan felt the truth settle heavily between them. "I am sorry." Nia closed her eyes. "I know. No. I mean it." His voice cracked slightly. "I missed his entire life." For the first time, she heard something different beneath his words. Not guilt. Grief. The grief of a man finally understanding the size of what had been taken from him. Outside Nia's home, evening shadows stretched across the yard. Inside, Mason sat at the kitchen table preparing for Chicago, completely unaware that another piece of the mystery surrounding his life had finally fallen into place. Chicago welcomed thousands of young innovators from across the country. The convention center buzzed with energy from the moment the doors opened. Giant screens displayed student inventions. Judges moved between exhibits. Reporters interviewed finalists. Families filled the audience seating. Yet for Mason, everything felt strangely calm. Weeks of preparation had led to this moment. His presentation stood ready. His research was complete. Most importantly, the people who mattered most to him were both in the room. Nia sat near the front row, watching with quiet pride. Ethan sat several seats away, not as a sponsor this time, but as someone who genuinely wanted to see Mason succeed. The journey that brought them here had changed all three of their lives. The truth about the letters had finally emerged. The years of silence were no longer a mystery. The walls built from misunderstanding had begun to fall. Yet one conversation still remained. One truth still waited to be spoken openly. As the afternoon session began, Mason stepped onto the stage to present his project. The lights illuminated his face. The audience quieted. Confidence replaced nervousness almost immediately. He explained his research with the same clarity and passion that had impressed judges throughout the year. Every answer demonstrated intelligence beyond his age. Every explanation reflected months of effort. More than once, members of the audience exchanged impressed glances. Ethan watched from his seat, feeling emotions he struggled to describe. Pride was part of it. Regret was part of it. Wonder was part of it. He thought about every birthday he had missed, every science fair, every ordinary afternoon he never experienced. Yet for the first time, those thoughts were no longer focused on what had been lost. They were focused on what might still be possible. When the final presentations ended, the audience erupted into applause. Hours later, the awards ceremony began. Students gathered near the stage. Families filled every seat. Cameras pointed toward the finalists. The host smiled as she approached the microphone. This year has showcased some of the brightest young minds in America. Applause echoed through the hall. And one student stood out not only for innovation, but for leadership, curiosity, and a commitment to helping others learn. Mason looked down at his hands. Nia squeezed them gently. Ethan held his breath. This year's National Young Innovator Award goes to Mason Brooks. The room exploded with applause. Mason froze for a second before rising to his feet. Nia laughed through tears. Ethan stood with everyone else, clapping harder than he could remember clapping for anything in years. Mason walked toward the stage beneath a sea of flashing cameras. He accepted the award and smiled nervously as the host handed him the microphone. "Would you like to say a few words?" Mason glanced toward the audience. For a moment, he seemed overwhelmed. Then he spotted his mother. Beside her sat Ethan. Something settled inside him. He nodded. "I do." The room became silent. "A lot of people helped me get here," Mason began. "My teachers, my friends, the judges." He paused. "But mostly my mom." The audience applauded. Nia lowered her head briefly. Mason smiled. "She taught me that big problems are solved one small step at a time." Ethan felt his chest tighten. The same words. The same lesson. Mason continued. "She taught me that character matters more than success. And she never stopped believing in me." Another wave of applause followed. Then Mason took a breath. "There is something else I want to say." The room quieted again. "A few months ago, I thought I knew my whole story." He looked toward Ethan. "Then I learned that life is more complicated than I realized." Nia's eyes widened slightly. Mason smiled. "I learned that sometimes good people can lose years because of mistakes they never made." Absolute silence filled the hall. "And I learned that when the truth finally comes out, you have a choice. You can stay angry, or you can build something better." Ethan felt tears gathering despite every effort to stop them. Mason looked directly at him. "The person who inspired some of my work did not know how much he inspired me." His voice softened. "But he knows now." Ethan stood slowly. The audience followed his gaze. For a few seconds, no one moved. Then Mason smiled. A real smile. Warm. Certain. "Thank you for finding your way back." The entire room rose into a standing ovation. Nia looked at Ethan through tears she no longer tried to hide. 10 years of silence had ended not with revenge, bitterness, or blame, but with truth. And in the bright lights of that crowded hall, 3 lives finally began moving forward together.